collaborator and co-host, Brendan DeCaires, who will speak on behalf of PEN Canada.
Thank you, Beverly, and I can't say how delighted I am to be able to partner with the Center for Caribbean Studies on a series of literary events over the last few months and the next few months. As a West Indian who's lived in Toronto now for 20 years, it's something that gives me enormous pride. PEN Canada is one of 130 PEN centres around the world. We defend freedom of expression, we celebrate the power of the written word, and we help writers who've been exiled from their countries. Sorry, I saw someone at the back indicating. To make new homes in Canada. We've been around for about 100 years. If you'd like to know more about our work, please go to pencanada.ca or look us up on Instagram or Facebook. Now, I just wanted to take this opportunity to say a little bit about how I see Olive. Because I remember the first time we met was about 15 years ago at the Bocas Festival in Trinidad. And there was a conversation that was along the usual sort of high-flown, somewhat pretentious lines of Caribbean novel and the future of literature or something. And the venue was the Old Fire Station. For those of you who know Port of Spain well, it's next to the National Library near the Red House and obliquely opposite Woodford Square. For those of you who don't know Trinidad, Woodford Square is where you would go to hear the sort of speaker's corner, people debating the rise in cooking gas and the latest political scandal and so on. So very much the sort of vox pop part of Trinidad. And in the middle of this conversation, school ended, and there was this almighty racket outside the Old Fire Station, and nobody in the room could hear anything. And one of the panelists, who I think was Christopher Cozier, the artist, said very astutely, he said, the reason they are making so much noise out there is that they don't feel they belong in here. And that is the point of this party. I would like to take a very quick contextualization of how I see Olive in those particular terms. Now, the first generation of post-colonial writing in the Caribbean was dominated by a few of what you might think of as the big beasts of West Indian literature. For those of you who know, it would be people like Derek Walcott, Wilson Harris, George Lamming, C.L.R. James. And the closer you look at these people, the more you realize that they were all fairly predictable. They were middle class, they often had foreign educations, and as time went on, and they realized the sort of deep Philistinism of the societies that they were trying to create literature for, they all became exiles. Now, there was an enormous amount of what you might think of as cultural nationalism in this first early phase, and I just wanted to give you a sense of some of that. In 1960, in a book of essays called The Pleasures of Exile, George Lamming wrote the following in his usual oracular tone. There are, for me, just three important events in British Caribbean history. The first event is the discovery. That began, like most other discoveries, with a journey inside or a journey out and across. This was the meaning of Columbus. The second event was the abolition of slavery and the arrival of East, India and China in the Caribbean Sea. The world met here, and it was at every level except administration, a peasant world. Very interesting framing. And the third important event, now this, brace yourselves, the third important event in our history is the discovery of the novel by West Indians as a way of investigating and projecting the inner experiences of the West Indian community. Now, this is very important because it sets up a critical framing of West Indian literature that persists for most of my lifetime. It is middle class, fairly intellectual. It is caught up in the arguments of the literary metropole, which in this case happened to be London, which is where Naipaul and Lamming and Wolcott, and all of them got their start through Caribbean Voices, the BBC program. And it set the sort of agenda for how West Indian writing was seen and understood. It left out the different races. Most of them were black middle class. It largely overlooked other classes. It was heteronormative, so there was very little understanding of queer writing. And of course, as he put it, the novel. So it didn't look at any of the other genres that were emerging or that would emerge. Now, over the last 25 years or so, a number of critics have widened the scope of this canon, and they have brought into view all these writings that were sort of excluded. And this is why I think it is fascinating, because there were writers who from the start were not captured by this framing, Exhibit A. And I think that during this period of revision, this broader curiosity emerged and became part of the foreground. And this is why I always think of Olive in these terms. Now, the critic, Denise de Carries-Derrine, who is my cousin, full disclosure, wrote a very intriguing analysis of Olive's work in this context as a sort of an underappreciated feminist creator in the Caribbean. And I think that in this revaluation of the canon, it's fair to say that her work is most notable for persistently redirecting our attention away from the sort of highbrow cultural tussles that dominated the work of the big beasts, and into these interstitial spaces which characterize the Caribbean, as people like me, who grew up there, actually know it. It's a place of fusions, of confusions. It's a place in which little girls who are at the periphery of a society will ask a clergyman if angels wear brassieres, which I thought is one of the loveliest details. And it's a curiosity about the lives of working people. And this is the context, I think, in which I would like to frame Olive for this evening. In Denise's words, she employed a quieter and more subversively cunning set of literary strategies when approaching her topic. And she decided not to pursue the more aggressive sort of posturing that Creole speech was characterized by in the early West Indian writings. This is an enormous achievement, and it's one that has lasted for decades. So, in a nutshell, if you go back to where I began, Olive is one of the few writers who I think, for the entirety of her career, has been inviting the children outside that room and showing them that there is a substantial body of West Indian writing that sees them, that celebrates them, that they would find their lives reflected in. And that is an enormous achievement. That I will end there, but this is not the only time we will collaborate. And for those of you who enjoy this evening, I hope that you will join us in a month's time, on November the 13th, for an evening of poetry reading with the St. Lucian / Canadian poet and author, Canicia Lubrin, who is the winner of the Wyndham Campbell Prize and most recently the Carol Shields Prize. That is across the road at the William Dew Auditorium, and it begins at 6 p.m. Thank you very much.
Melanie Wheaton is a professor in the Departments of History and Caribbean Studies and Associate Chair of Graduate Studies in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. She received her doctorate in modern history from Oxford University in 2001. Professor Newton specializes in the history of the Caribbean and the Atlantic world and is the author of The Children of Africa in the Colonies, Free People of Color in Barbados in the Age of Emancipation, published in 2008, and numerous scholarly articles on gender, slavery, and slave emancipation, and Indigenous Caribbean history. Some notable publications related to today's event include The Race Left at Sauterre, Genocide, Narrative, and Indigenous Exile from the Caribbean, published in the Caribbean Quarterly, Returns to Our Native Land, Indigeneity and Decolonization in the Anglophone Caribbean, published in Small Acts, and Counterpoints of Conquest, The Royal Proclamation of 1763, The Lesser Antilles and the Ethnocartography of Genocide, published in the William and Mary Quarterly. Professor Newton is also celebrated for her role in the renaming of Yonge and Dundas Square, named after Henry Dundas, an infamous slave trader. Sankofa Square, a word in the true language that entreats us to learn from the past in order to build a better future. Professor Newton's current research project is entitled, This Island's Mine, Indigeneity in the Caribbean Atlantic World. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Melanie Newton.
Wonderful to see so many people here and to stand at a Caribbean Studies event. It's wonderful. I'm in history, but this is in many ways where my heart is as a scholar and as a person. So it's lovely to see you all here. And it is such a pleasure to be here to celebrate Olive Senior, who has been a friend of this program as long as I have been at UT, and who I believe I first met at an event organized by a different book list over at the William Dew many years ago, when I was in my very first year as director of the program. So I am so excited to be here to celebrate you and to celebrate your work, and I am so grateful to you for the years that you have remained in conversation with the program. Thank you. Olive Senior is a prize-winning poet, author, and independent scholar. She has over 20 published books in almost every conceivable genre: poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and children's literature, as well as various essays on key social questions. She lives in Canada and Jamaica, and does what a lot of us wish we could do, and moves back and forth between there and here. And her work and numerous honors and awards reflect her global citizenship. In 2025, these honors include the award of Jamaica's Order of Distinction for her outstanding contribution to the literary arts. In 2024, she was named a Royal Society of Literature International Writer. Other awards, they're too numerous to list, include Canada's Writers' Trust Matt Cohen Award for Lifetime Achievement, the OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature, honorary doctorates from the University of the West Indies, Mona in Jamaica, and an honorary doctorate from York University. She also has the gold medal of the Institute of Jamaica. Her latest work, and the one that brings us all together today, is the historical novel Paradise Once, seen through the eyes of Indigenous people of the Caribbean, specifically Cuba and what is today the Bahamas, a people who have come to call themselves the Taino. Also published in 2025 is her anthology of poems by Jamaican poets and photographs of trees, which are a key theme that runs through her work, titled Trees Seen, a reflection of her commitment to environmental awareness as Poet Laureate of Jamaica from 2021 to 2024. Other recent books include Hurricane Watch, News and Collected Poems, and Pandemic Poems, First Wave. Olive Senior's work has found worldwide resonance in numerous critical essays and translations, and is taught in educational institutions at various levels. And many of us would have been introduced to Caribbean literature through her work in school. Summer Lightning, her first book and winner of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, was named one of the 70 outstanding books from the Commonwealth chosen to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee. Her popularity as one of the Caribbean's foremost writers, the arm of empire is long, I tell you. Her popularity as one of the Caribbean's foremost writers was cemented when 4 of her books were included in the first compilation in 2021 of the 100 Caribbean Books That Made Us, organized by the Locust Literary Festival. She has been a writing mentor for many, many years. She's taught at various institutions, including the Humber School for Writers and Diaspora Dialogues in Canada. And I'm sure that in addition to the many people who she knows over the course of her writing career she has mentored, there are people who she does not even know, whose relationships to literature, relationships to the Caribbean, relationships to words and the magic that they create, people she will never even know. And that is really a mark of an incredible journey, and we are so glad that you're going to be with us today for just a few brief moments of that journey. So thank you. And so I think the next up we have our first reading from Olive Senior. Which will be opening to set the context and a reading from Paradise Lost.
She's sitting here on the over the speaker.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Yep. The back. Not yet. How about now? Yes. Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I was so busy listening to people talking about somebody I didn't recognize that I lost track of where I was, and what was going on. But anyway, good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure being here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this occasion. Words, I'm at the stage of being very articulate at this moment. But it really is a pleasure to be here. And I just want to say a few words about my book, if they haven't yet bought and read it. It is about the people that Columbus encountered in the Caribbean when he sailed the ocean blue in 1492. We know them today as the Taino. They are the people, it is believed, who came on by sea from the region which is now the sort of Orinoco region of the Americas. And they're descended from perhaps Arawak speakers. So in the English colonies, they were known as Arawaks up to recently. And if you're my age or even younger, you were told in school that Columbus met these primitive little people who sort of vanished. And to be honest, all my life, I have wondered about how people could vanish like that. And so I've spent a lot of my time trying to discover as much as I can about the Taino. I'll just say that the waves of indigenous people came from the south to the northern Caribbean. And the Taino, the people we call the Taino, because we don't know what they call themselves, settled the larger islands from Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, which is Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti, Cuba, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and so on, those islands. And they were not, I mean, they came in waves, and there were people before them on the islands. But I like to think of them the way we think of ourselves as Caribbean people today, where we have distinct cultures, distinct island populations, but at the same time we feel that we are the same people in a way. And I think this was probably the same for the Taino, who were masters of the sea. They had ocean-going canoes that were bigger than Columbus's flagship. So there was a lot of movement by water in the Caribbean basin, much easier than it is today actually to get around. And so we shouldn't think of them as people who just sat there in an inner kind of way, but as I tried to portray in my book, this is a very dynamic part of the world as it is today, with people, with different people intermixing. There are traders and so on and so forth. So I'm going to read a section about a woman who is not Taino. She is in fact descended from an earlier people who occupied the islands. We don't know anything about them. They were called Archaic Indians. They were displaced by the Taino, who then looked down on them as, you know, primitive and so on and so forth. And the woman in my book called Crab Claw is believed to be the last of the line of the last descendant, survivor of these people who died off. And so I'll just read a little about her. And the first part of the book, in the first part of the book, first section, what I tried to do was establish the village that is destroyed, and it's based on an actual incident that happened. But also I wanted to give people an idea of what it was like to be a Taino, to live in this world at this time, 2 generations after Columbus came. And I imagine there were people like us. They had their quarrels, they had their fights, they had their desires, etc., etc. I think of them as being modern in that sense. And Crab Claw is alienated because she is a survivor, and she's also, as you'll see, looked down on by, you know, the rest of the tiny population. Crab Claw sat back on her heels and rested her hands on her ample lap, allowing her thoughts to wander. She thought back to the day the hunters found her. She had not been abandoned or lost. Her father had left her to be found. Everyone else had died from the sickness. Her mother had gone. Her father was ill. She never understood why she hadn't been ill too. That day, her father had risen from his sickbed and dressed his only child in all their wealth, numerous strings of shell beads, finely crafted. He took her to a trail and told her to wait under a tree for the hunters who would take her to their Ucayeke. She said, "I'm afraid the hunters will eat me." "No," her father responded. "Sometimes we're friends. We trade. Say, 'Tagwe, good day,' when you see them." He made her practice, "Tagwe." Then say, "Bara," and point to our cave. That means dead. They will take care of you. He vanished, and she was alone. She sat there and never moved. For how long, she had no idea. For her mind drifted away to a land that was full of huge animals that were friendly and talked to her, so she did not feel alone. Uncle Bear, Father Mammal, Brother Raven. When the hunters came, she said, "Tagwe and Bara," and they took her to their village. All she remembered was that Matron Dreamstone was the one who had taken off her necklaces. "I will put them in a safe place for you," she had said. Crab Claw never moved a muscle as the lady removed them all, until the smallest one remained, a little circlet with a pendant carved in a strange shape. The child didn't know it was the finest one of all. When the lady attempted to remove it, she cried. She didn't tell her that her mother had taken it away from her own neck and put it around hers when she was a baby, just as all their mothers had done, going as far back as anyone remembered. That much she knew. It was the only record she had of her own history. The lady seemed to understand because she left the necklace with the strange pendant alone, smiled, patted her on the head, and popped a sweet into her mouth. The taste was strange, but it comforted her. The lady summoned a woman of the Redbird family who had no living children and handed her over. She had joined the kin group in their bohil. The other children teased her unmercifully, and she couldn't speak, but she didn't know their language. But that didn't stop her from carrying out her duties day and night. The father, Dark Rain Cloud, soon got sick. No one could help him. Crabclaw, for so they had named her, went and stood beside his hamaka, as she sometimes did, and wiped his face with baths dipped in water. He hardly noticed her, so far gone was he. But some impulse made her look deeply at him, as if seeing him for the first time, look so hard she could see right through him, and so located the blockage that was the source of his illness. And the voice that spoke in the language of the old ones gave her a song. She sat on a low stool by his hamaka and sang the song all night and into the next day. She could feel the tumor struggling against the power of her song, but finally with a great wrench it broke away and dissolved, and her singing ceased as abruptly as it began. Dark Rain Cloud opened his eyes for the first time in days and smiled at her. "Thank you," he said. Everyone saw and heard these things, for the girl's singing had attracted first the residents of the house, and then, as news traveled, those from other bohíos. They seated themselves in a circle around the girl and the sick man by the fire, and found themselves swaying their bodies and humming along with her song. The little girl never faltered once in her singing, repeating strange words in a kind of enchanted loop that swirled around them and came back to the place where it started and took off again. But once the man opened his eyes and said, "Thank you," she fell over from the stool on which she was sitting and didn't wake up from the hamaka they laid her in until late the following day. Far from integrating her into the family or the village, the incident only emphasized her strangeness, especially when they saw a Dark Rain Cloud walking about as if he had never been ill, when they'd long ago given him over for dead. Now, people's attitudes were not scorn or pity, but became tinged with fear. Crabclaw never knew the difference. She only felt her own sadness.
Oh, no. Oh, yes. So first of all, I really want to thank you for this beautiful book. And I'm just going to let you know I'll be asking some questions of Olive for about half an hour, and then we will be opening it up to questions from the audience. So you can take this time maybe to think about questions that you would like to ask about this book or about all this other work. But our conversation will be focused on this book, which is beautiful. And I don't want to give too much away, because we want you to buy the book. Just a reminder, it is presented. But it's set around 1513. It's a couple of decades, about 20 years, about 20 years after the arrival of Columbus, and it's the conquest of Cuba under Narvaez and Velázquez, which is extremely brutal. But the beautiful thing about the book is that you choose to welcome the reader into the everyday life of this community, and then you slowly reveal that it's fact that what's happening is happening in Cuba, and the context of basically a genocide that's taking place on the island. And there's this slowly sort of growing horror that's almost surreal about the context in which the lives that we're all invested in are taking place, and and the catalyst is the arrival of the trader with this booster. And so I don't want to give anything away, but by that point you know what's coming, and you just desperately want to know if these characters will survive. It's beautifully crafted. And I really see in it many themes from your previous work. There's a gender and coming of age, conquest, importance of Caribbean people's relationship with the land and the water. But there are these profound rethinkings of temporality in Caribbean history, of how we think about the time before 1492 and challenging the idea as a period sort of before history, And I think that's lovely, and I think about it in the context of, I can think of two other novels that attempt to think about this period. You probably are familiar with them. I don't know if you know Gloria Vaughn's Yokobu. With all due respect, it's okay. And no, I don't want to throw shade, but you know, I think these novels it's a journey to have this conversation. So, and then Jose Barrero's Taino.
Yes, I know politics.
And also set in Cuba, and I see some interesting conversations between particularly your book and Jose Barrero's, but also some really fundamental differences, and that's where I want to situate the conversation. And the first question I want to ask you is, when you imagine your dream reader for this book, who is it?
Well, I don't know that I ever imagined a dream reader for anything that I write. I write and send it out in the world, and I hope it lands somewhere. So I'm not sure I have a dream reader in my head, but I certainly would like the book to start a conversation about history and how we view history, especially in the English-speaking Caribbean and in Jamaica, where I'm from, where we think history began either in 1492 or 1494 or in 1655 when the British took the island from the Spaniards and the plantation system began. And we've totally ignored the fact that, first of all, we're told that the Caribbean islands have been inhabited for over 6,000 years, but also that these people existed as real people long before Columbus arrived, and they are still a part of who we are, whether by blood or by culture. You know, I say every day we eat bami, we are participating in a kind of indigenous ritual, which goes back thousands of years. So this is really what I'd like people to take away from the book, a reconsideration of who we are and what is our history, where does it begin?
And in fact, of all the indigenous languages in the Americas, the largest numbers of loanwords that have passed into European languages from the Americas come from the Northern Caribbean, from the Taino language. So, I listened to you speak once, talking about growing up in the cockpit country and the relationship between your own memories and the surroundings. But then I can clearly tell that this book is based on extensive research, and that is hard work to produce something with this level of sort of material, like closeness, believability. And in another context, I've heard you speak about the importance of both book learning and ground truths. So book learning on the one hand, obviously, that's one, but then ground truths, the experience that you acquire throughout your life. And Jose Barrero also talked about the need to, as he put it, walk the land. So I wondered if you could speak more about that relationship between book learning and ground truths in this book. Book learning and ground truths.
Yeah, and I just gave a lecture in Jamaica actually where I reframed that as the book of life and the book of rules. And the book of rules is a written word, and the book of life is what we learn by experience, which is handed down by the oral culture. And I think both of those books are what have shaped me, and which I can't help extracting from both of these books in whatever I write, and that includes a book about the indigenous people as well, because yes, I've done an enormous amount of research, not to write the novel, just to satisfy my own curiosity going back, decades. And I've actually written a lot of poems based on kind of mythology and so on. So the novel is fairly recent in terms of my saying, what am I going to do with all this stuff? But in terms of, so a lot of my research, of course, is based on what others have done, what scholars have done, and so on. But at the same time, as I was gaining knowledge about the indigenous people, it occurred to me that I was living in a space where I was sharing sharing a world with the indigenous people who were still alive in us. And one example is, I've told this before, But growing up in the country, I walked to primary school we had a river, along a riverbank, and it was covered with guava trees. And guava is the sacred plant of the Taino, right? Which I didn't know at the time. But if you know guava, you'll wake up every morning and half the ripe fruit have been eaten, by creatures. And scientists say they're eaten by bats, right? Because it's pollinated by bats at night. So we were there eating guavas, and then we discovered that it is the sacred fruit of the Taino, and it is a food of the dead, because they believe that at night, the Taino, the dead, came out and had parties and lived the kind of life they lived on Earth, which I sort of like, and they feasted on guavas, which is why the guavas were eaten. So, so there came about a lot of examples in my own life where I could look back and say, yeah, this was a direct connection, but we never knew. We were never told any of these things. We weren't told that hurricane or huracan comes from the Taino, and their symbol is of the eye of the hurricane and how the hurricane moves, and so on and so forth. Or that canoe, and the way the canoe was built from a cotton tree originally with fire and axe and so on is a direct retention from that culture. So Bami, as I mentioned, which is, Jamaica's favorite food, breakfast, and now other times, is from yucca, the cassava plant, which is, again, the most sacred plant of the Taino, and of others in the Americas who had to learn to extract poison from bitter cassava, which took thousands of years, and I suspect a lot of deaths in that experiment. The point is that today, we're still processing bitter cassava the same way. So I felt a little sad that there were so many ways in which our culture was reflecting our indigenous heritage, and we failed to recognize it. And so in a way, my reader for the book is somebody that I want to read the book and say, wow, I didn't know that. The same way I discovered these things.
Yes, someone you want to read the book and then look around them and see things.
Yeah, exactly.
And themselves.
Yes.
With new eyes.
Yes, with new eyes, yeah.
So, you mentioned, and it's so clear, the research that goes into this book, and across different disciplines. I'm a historian, obviously, but historians in particular and archaeologists who worked on the Caribbean are famous, or infamous rather, for continuing. Things have changed a bit now, but for a long time, even in all the years that you were writing poems that really thought about the histories of indigeneity and so on, the narrative of indigenous absence, that the first, great crime of Europeans in the Americas was the destruction of the indigenous people in the Northern Caribbean, and they're all gone from that shame. So that assumption that people are gone and that there's nothing left of them other than these cultural continuities, and you really make a choice in this book to challenge that understanding of that relationship between the Caribbean present and the Caribbean past, so that indigeneity in the novel is not just, as important as these things are, cultural continuities, but people, survivors. The story, basically, of the coming into being of what is the initial community of Cimarrones or Maroons, who survived this massacre. And I just wondered about the moment where you decided that was, it's very different for example, from Lucy Barrero's time.
Yes.
So that the choice is very clear. That challenge some of these long established narratives.
Yeah, a lot of it was, I didn't consciously think this through. I write and then I look back and said, oh, I did that, and so on, because I was really working through characters. I wanted the characters to carry the story. I wanted it, although it starts off with genocide, it's a story of really painful. I wanted it to have an upbeat ending because we're here. We are here, And so I wanted it to end, and I also wanted to make the link with the Maroons, because the first Maroons were in fact the indigenous people, and the Africans, the first Africans who fled. And there was that combination from the very start, which in a sense is not the common view of, Maroons and so on. A lot of it came out of, I guess, my larger thinking about the Caribbean, about history, how we view ourselves, how we think about things. And so I wasn't consciously saying, I'm going to do this, that, and the other. I think a lot of it came out of my development of the characters. I knew where I wanted it to go. I wanted it to end with them as Maroons in the mountains, fighting for, forming a resistance to this colonial, initial impact of colonialism. I knew that much. And so I think once I knew where I wanted to go and who the characters were, and they were setting out on a journey, which, in terms of fiction is a powerful tool. I think all the other things that I, as Olive Senior, think about all the time just became embedded in that narrative, because that's how I write. If you read my work, you will know what my worldview is. No matter what it is that I write, whether it's a poem or not, my worldview is going to come out in that space. So I think it was the same with this book,
Yeah, it comes through really beautifully, and it really, that choice to tell the story of the relationships, again, trying not to give things away, but the relationships between these people, survivors from this village, then there's the African man sick who meet at this terrible moment, and that the connection, the way that you connect that moment, but then their past, like his past, the story of his parents, separation from them, and then all the inequalities and hierarchies in this village. It's a way of thinking about history in which there is no prehistoric. There's no prehistoric people. They're only people.
They're people. That's exactly how to me, they're very much alive, And one of the things that struck me after I had done it, again, I hadn't thought of it, was that how Saku, the African, how he learns history. His great whatever grandfather was a griot, and so he was part of that oral history tradition. And he's talking to the Taino, who have the Arietos, which is the oral history tradition. This is how they transmit information. But he brings a book. He brings a book because he's literate, and he has the Adventures of Marco Polo, which he's reading to them. And so for me, this is a world, and it represents even the Caribbean today, where all the worlds came together at that moment. And the Caribbean is still central in this way, to this many worlds meeting, and forging something new. But it was one of the things I liked about showing how, in a way, they were all refugees, they were all displaced people coming together, like the woman Crab Claw. I have her reaching back to the first moment indigenous people are supposed to have come over into the Americas. And then I have so-called Carib, the Kalinago coming in. And, so to me, this is a meeting place. We had refugees from the Bahamas coming. So in many ways, it's not unlike our world today. A world where people are being rapidly destroyed and worlds are being erased. So I felt this very strongly, this sense of modernity, within this space, 16th century space.
And the choice that you made, I'm going to come back to ask a question in a moment about the present, in a sense. But the fact that you choose you don't focus, I think about books like, say, Adish Dotika's book for children for schools, about Anna Kawana, who's Or again, Mr. Barrero's decision to focus on this historical figure of the Colón, his relationship with Las Casas. And so there are these choices to focus on figures who are, in some sense, elite or connected to elite figures. And usually you choose actively not to do that.
Yes.
So people are spoken about.
Yes, I
And there's
referred to
even a
them.
Kaunabo in the book, but it's not that Kaunabo.
No,
It's
no.
a refugee. And so that choice to center the story on these fictive characters who are ordinary people.
And young people.
Yeah.
They're, most of them are
At various ages,
Yes.
Candlewood,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
at various stages. Well, it's because I write fiction through characters, you know what I mean? And so once you decide to tell the story through the mind of a person, then it becomes very personal. Rather than using a third-person narrative of history, I wanted to show history unfolding in the lives of these people who are impacted by the greatest event that has taken place, the meeting of the old and the new worlds in this place. And they are the collateral damage, it's collateral damage, because they're destroyed in the process. But I also wanted, one of the things that intrigued me was how did the Taino or the indigenous people feel about the encounter? All we know about it is what we read from, the Spanish. We know the Spanish, how the Spanish felt. But I wanted to know, so I put myself in that situation and I thought, what would we do if a Martian, landed on our lawn? Let us say they looked human, but they were different in so many ways. What would our approach be? And it's sort of approach avoidance, because those two things operate in us as human beings. And so I'm showing the Taino like this, where on the one hand, they want to capture something of the magic of these strange creatures who have arrived, but at the same time they're fearful, and of course they're fearful of their own cultural integrity being compromised and so on. So I was sort of intrigued by that relationship. So I put myself into that situation and imagined how I would feel, or how any of us would feel if we had that kind of encounter with, as I say, they're like aliens landing. The Taino, we're not sure if they had sail on their boats. So when these ships with sails arrived, they thought they were birds, huge birds landing on the sea. It was that alien. They were clothed, they were wearing clothes, they had beards and long hair and all the rest of it. So
Didn't smell great either.
and they didn't smell great, and they didn't behave very nicely either. So in a way, it was just trying to imagine myself, and even the way the villagers react and treat one another. I'm saying, well, this is how we are, so I didn't want to write a sanitized version of these people. I wanted to treat them the way we treat each other.
Yes, and I think about a character, a good villain is just wonderful. And we have an excellent villain. But also, a very poignant villain in the figure of Shakti, who is himself a refugee. And I wondered if you could say more about the choice to make a figure who is depicting such an essential experience of the conquest of the Bahamas, his own capture, but then to make him this almost timeless, almost sociopathic. He's a really good villain, I have to tell you.
A lot of people like him, which upsets me greatly.
He's so compelling. He's such a very
Sharptooth is my favorite character. In the Taino worldview, you always have two sides of everything. So we have the good shaman in Candlewood who looks after the society, the good of society. So you have to have the opposite, who is Sharptooth, who is, he binds his soul to the underground powers in order to enrich himself, really. So that is a pairing that was sort of automatic. Once you have one thing, you have to have the other in this culture. But I have to tell you that Sharktooth arrived in that village as a refugee, and I had no idea who he was, literally. And he began to take on more and more, a stronger and stronger role in the village. And then I had to stop one day when I was writing and say, hold on, where did he come from? What is his backstory? And I have to confess, I had a lot of fun writing his
I
backstory.
can tell.
So why are you surprised people like it?
And I read.
It's clear that you care about him. That's the
Really, I
thing.
care about all my characters, but I also read there is a lot of research now about the dark shaman, including in Ghana and places like that, you know, and so I immersed myself in some really horrible stories of people and so on and so forth. But he sort of evolved, like his backstory, I didn't know where it was going. It was almost magical, it just took over. The whole business with the old man and the crocodiles and the what have you. And I have to confess, I rather liked writing it, you know? But I had to get rid of him too, I won't tell you how. So yeah, but he's very much a part of the story of the indigenous people. You do have people like that. You have to, if you have light, you have to have dark. If you have the good shaman, you have to have the guy of the underground and so on. It's not just a taino, it's part of the whole tradition. So I was unearthing that sort of tradition.
Yeah, you bring that together beautifully with, again, this, what is in fact a sort of deep psychological exploration of this person. That actually I felt adds to the humanity of the story, that, you know, a terrible thing can happen to people without making them good people.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that the terrible thing that happened is okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted him to have a redemption arc, but I also didn't, so I really.
It wasn't possible. Redemption wasn't
It was not
possible in this,
No.
in terms of the book,
No,
of
absolutely
the
not.
culture.
Not at all. And I guess I wanted to ask, and I then want to open it up to the audience, because I'm sure people are now having questions, to bring it to the present, and the importance of a novel, and a powerful novel like the one that you've written about this historical moment in the moment that we're living in now. I mean, you tell a story of both genocidal loss and apocalypse, but then of the remaking of community after this apocalypse, or even in the midst of this apocalypse. And I wondered, you know, thinking about the context of our moment, if you think, what did it mean to you rewriting this now?
Yeah. I was thinking of that too, because we can't help but think about the moment we're living in, you know what I mean? And the sense of despair that I think a lot of us feel. But at the same time, I always feel, I wouldn't describe myself as an optimist, but I'm open to possibilities. I live a life that's open to possibilities. Otherwise, you might as well jump in the grave and, you know, pull the cover over on it. So I didn't, although I mean, the story is so horrific. People don't realize how awful it was, the settlement of the Americas by Europeans. And so there's a lot of horror there. But at the same time, I believe that what makes us powerful as people is the way we, for generations, manage to transcend that horror. Whether it's the horror of slavery or, you know, genocide or what have you. I keep saying we're here. And we're here because we believe in life. We believe, you know, there is a power that impels us to continue despite whatever terrible experiences we might have. And this is the state of the world today. A lot of people in the world are confronting these issues and making these kinds of decisions. If, you know, I mean, we don't want to get too political, but it's obvious that this is happening in so many places. And so I think as a writer, my job is, I don't want to write something that ends in despair. You know, I want to write something that says 500 years later, there might be a revival of this culture. And I have to tell you, when I wrote my Encyclopedia of Jamaican Heritage, I have a lot of entries about the Taino and their culture and so on. I never said they had vanished, but a reviewer in The Guardian said the Taino had vanished. And the first communication I got concerning this book was from somebody in Puerto Rico who wrote and said, we want to let you know we are still here, a Taino person. And to me, this is the power of literature, of what we're doing. It's very important that creative artists, you know, people who are creatives, should share a feeling of, as I say, possibility, of openness, of a future that's there for all of us, rather than closing the door. So that's what I want to do.
Well, I think, you know, I can definitely speak on behalf of everyone here. Those of you who have read the book, that you know, it absolutely, you know, it's a book that I think the Caribbean needs, but also a book I think we all need right now, and a reminder to those in power who are in the act, as we speak, of committing genocide. That, you know, you cannot kill community so easily. And the Caribbean offers so many things, including an example of that survival. So thank you for capturing that story. So now, I'd like to open it to questions from the audience. And I just want to ask people, oh, you can't hear me this whole time? Could you all not hear me in the back? I can hear you. Said something.
We can hear you.
Yeah, Mr. Betsy.
How about me?
See, to me, it's loud, right? So that's okay. Yeah. That's better? Okay. Okay. All right. So, well, I'm not the one you needed to hear anyway, so it doesn't matter. So we're going to open it up to the audience. I'm going to ask people to not create a situation in which I have to ask you to stop. So that'll be awkward for all involved. So please ask a question. If you want to say something to Olive, that's fine, but please be mindful that it's a very full room and many people who want to say things and ask questions. So, and I will stop you if I have to. Okay. You want to? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You having all right? Yeah, my name is Takura Rastakura, and I'm a poet from Jamaica, right? Very familiar with Miss Alice Senior, you know, and I'm feeling really grateful to be here and seeing her sharing the whole energy of her poetry and her journey of her book, you know. But I have one question, right? What do you think the relationship with the current Jamaican people who's living on the island now? What do you think the relationship between the Jamaican people and the Tainos would be like now in 2025? Respect.
Respect, Rasta. Well, I think is this on? Yeah. I think what's happening today is that there are Taino people or people who claim descent from Taino in Jamaica and the other islands who are taking their cue from what is happening elsewhere in the Americas, where there is a whole revival of indigenous culture, an assertion of that. And I think it's happening in Jamaica. We have a Taino cacique for the first time in 500 years, who is also part Maroon. And it's interesting that the Maroons and the Taino are making common cause in terms of issues that affect them, you know, like land over. There are a lot of legal issues surrounding indigeneity and maroons and so on and so on. That's happening, but I'm amazed at how many people are now coming out and saying we have, you know, or we were always told in our families that we have Taino blood. And to me, it's not a matter of blood, it's also a matter of culture. How do you feel about, in the way I have, my DNA shows that I have indigenous culture. I don't know if it's Taino or not, and I don't really care, because I have 7 or 8 different bloodstreams flowing in me. But I have felt, as a child, very close to this, you know, to this culture, and to me that is what matters. And I think it is happening in all of these countries, Trinidad, Dominica, the Kalinago, and so on. There is this great awareness among people that we are more than what we're told we are. So what we need to do, what I'd like to see in Jamaica, is greater attention from an official level, acknowledging this. We have 2 Arawak Indians on our coat of arms. Why are they there, you know? But we've totally failed to acknowledge this, and I would like to see, I'm hoping my book would start this kind of conversation. And people came to my book launch in Jamaica who were shocked to say that there was a Taino chief, that there are people claiming to be Taino, that, and you know, the knowledge that we're beginning to share. We had pineapples and we had Taino food and so on. So I would, as I say, I would like us to start a conversation about how we view history. Where does history begin? Does it have a beginning? You know? And where do we go from here? And we really need to acknowledge the indigenous element in our history and our lives in a way we have not done before. So, thank you very much.
A friend of mine, her name is Reverend Bridget Maya Douglas, and she's studying for her PhD in this subject. She is part of the indigenous people of Jamaica. And I'm hesitant to name the tribe because I may get it wrong. But I hope that she will get this book and that you and she will meet someday. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to, I didn't get the name, but afterwards.
Bridget Maya Douglas.
Okay, thank you.
Hi everyone, hi Olive. I'm married to Jamaica. Olive, because I do so much genealogy and DNA, and I've looked into so many Jamaican family trees, and my own husband, actually, so I don't say this, knew from the beginning that his mother from Dominican Republic had a written lineage that included a Taino. But one of the things that, I'm just taking what he has learned, Fed had told me that there was a study in Puerto Rico where people were asked what they thought their heritage was. And most people denied that they had any Taino connection whatsoever. But the DNA showed something different. So I wonder if you could speak about how those attitudes may be changing in the Caribbean.
Yes, and also I would like to introduce Fred, your husband, who I have just discovered has written a book about called Boyero, which I did not know about, but it is about Taino chief, Taino cacique. So please look out for it. It's not widely circulated, but I'm happy to know that there are other books on the topic, because it's telling us how much interest is being generated in the topic. On the question of how what's happening today in countries like some Spanish-speaking countries have denied for generations any connection with the Taino in the same way. When I first came to Canada as a student in the 60s, I was absolutely shocked at the attitude towards Indigenous people in Canada. I mean, I was absolutely shocked at that. And there is a Jamaican who came out some years ago and claimed to be Taino, and she was laughed to scorn. I mean, you know, because people said this is nonsense. Either these people have died off, or she went to an elite school where she was sort of, people treated her with scorn, because Indigenous people are treated in this scornful way everywhere. So a lot of people of Indigenous heritage, especially the Spanish islands, have denied this. But I think DNA evidence is now showing that I think it's over 60% of the population of the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, have Taino blood through the mother's side, which makes perfect sense if you think about it. You know, and in Jamaica it might not be so high, but I think a large proportion of Jamaicans also have Taino blood through descent on the mother's side, that DNA. So, so science is on the side of the Indigenous, because science is now telling us that what we have been told by these historians, excuse me, but I know I'm just teasing, is nonsensical, really, that these people simply died off, you know. And the Spanish-speaking island people, historians and archaeologists, have been in the forefront, actually, of the research into the Taino. But I can say I'm shocked at how much there is going on continuously. I mean, every day there are new articles coming out about new things being discovered, about these people who left nothing really in writing themselves. And yet so much can be discovered through new scientific techniques, and so on and so forth. So we're learning, every day we're learning more and more and more about these cultures. So.
I can say one thing, and if I should take your microphone.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I think that's a really important point. I think one of the things that shapes perceptions about Indigenous people in the Caribbean is the fact that so much of the mixture, which is exactly what you describe in your book, the communities are Afro-Indigenous communities, so people of African and Indigenous American heritage, and the racist narratives of the Americas claim, you know, like, well, blackness can't mix with anything, and a person who is black and Indigenous is a black person. They lose any claim to being Indigenous. So, that's a narrative that was used to both proliferate blackness as a form of to be scorned and to be exploited, sort of perpetually reproducible category for exploitation, but then to make indigeneity disappear. You know, these narratives of Indigenous purity. So I think that has really shaped the context in which people across the Caribbean who may have these stories in their families feel the levels of comfort that they feel. That whether if they say this, and there's someone who is physically of African heritage, people will say, well, you're a fraud.
Yes.
That can't be true because you don't look, quote unquote, like an Indigenous person. So it's so challenging, pushing back against what are ultimately these like biological racist ideas about what it means to be human. I think this is very important, and again, the book really challenges that.
I had my hand up, but it barely answered the question that I was going to ask.
Can you all hear me? There we go. Thanks so much for this book on it. I wanted to ask, because it's clear that so much research and the work of the imagination went into this book. I just wanted to ask, how long did it take you to write this book?
You know, I've been trying to write this book for, I would say, 20 years. And I've made numerous attempts to, and gave up. I mean, I just couldn't get going with it. And I have an author's note in the back of the book where I describe how I had to start the book where it started with this massacre. Once I did that, then I wrote it fairly quickly, because there was it was as if the ghosts of these people were saying to me from this village, were saying to me, you have to speak on our behalf. Because I've read just about everything of the Spanish Chronicles and all of Las Casas, and the incident of this massacre in the village is the one incident that just stuck in my brain. I couldn't get out of it, especially when Las Casas, simply because nobody can explain why it happened. It was pure cruelty. The villagers are welcoming, and suddenly one man draws his sword, and everybody follows, and it's a massacre. And Las Casas said blood was flowing as if cattle had been slaughtered. I read that maybe 40 years ago, but I just have never been able to get it out of my mind. And it's as if I had to start this book with that moment, or with this massacre in this village that was so unprovoked. And once I took that decision, I wrote it, I would say I wrote it quickly, but then once it was accepted for publication, I decided it was too long, and I cut out half the words. I went through and cut out every word that wasn't necessary. But the final book I wrote quickly, but it's taken me, I would say, easily 30 years to arrive at the moment of seeing that thing on the table. And of course, I mean, the characters change, because I didn't think of setting it in Cuba originally. I wanted to start it in a maroon village in the mountains of Jamaica with the roosters crowing, because the rooster plays a significant role in this book. But it just, nothing worked, until the spirits moved me to do what was right, which was to tell the story of these villages, which just simply encapsulates the story of all these Taino who were martyred and murdered, what have you.
Question here? Olive, thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear a story.
Sorry, we're going to bring you the mic.
Sorry.
Thank you, Olive, so much. It's wonderful to have the feeling of a world expanding and broadening out for all of us here. You just said as the Spirit moved you took that. Did you know from the beginning that this was going to be historical fiction? Or was there a point where you wondered if it was going to be history or fiction?
No, it would be, I'm not a historian, so I had amassed a lot of material, from historians, archaeologists, and so on, scientists. But no, I didn't think I was qualified to write a history. So it had to be fiction. But over the years, I've mined this material, and I've written an enormous number of poems that deal with the mythology of the Taino and, the indigenous people of the Americas. So in a way, I've been sort of using up the material, and then I said, oh, what do I do with this? I felt that I needed to do more. I'd accumulated all of this information, knowledge. Every day I'm still reading the latest articles. I'm still interested in it. And so it had to be historical fiction, you know what I mean? And I'm privileged as a fiction writer over the historian, because I can then, the historian has to stick to the facts, yeah? I tried very hard to depending on, yeah, that's true. But I tried very hard to be true to the knowledge that I've acquired. I tried very, very hard to be true to this culture. But there are things we don't know, and we'll never know. And so what I did was extrapolate from cultures that are close, that are close to the Taino culture, sort of the region where they come from, where there are living people who are indigenous, like Yan and so on. So an example is the girl in the book. Night Order. When she first sees her menses, she's put inside a little hut, and because the sun is not to see her. Now, I don't know if this is a Taino practice, but it is a practice of virtually every indigenous group in the region. So I think it's reasonable for me to assume, that this would happen. So there are little details like that where I didn't pull anything out of thin air. I really tried to find a parallel that existed somewhere. But I used my imagination to bring the history alive. This is what I tried to do by creating characters, situations, and so on. So this is where the novelist is privileged, over the historian. But I've benefited greatly from the research of, historians, archaeologists, and from just studying the mythology of the Taino and looking at their beautiful artifacts, the art that they created, So it's a combination of a lot of knowledge derived from many different sources.
We have time for a couple more questions. Sir.
I forgot what I was going I was expecting to get the mic, so I It'll come back.
Yeah. Oliver, I just wanted to, not so much a question, and I will keep it very quick, to let you know of a wonderful thing that I saw 10 years ago in Argentina, where they celebrated the life of an anthropologist who had become interested in indigenous communities. And he found a handful of speakers of languages that were dying, and he took them on the tour of southern Argentina. And they said a few words that they knew, and several people scattered around the place stood up and wept because it was the first time in 50 years they'd heard this language. And they used extractive grammars and so on, compiled dictionaries, and they taught this language. And the evening I was attending, they had recitations in these previously dying languages that had been revived. And at the Penn Congress I just attended in Krakow, there were 2 poems that were read that there are only 10 living speakers. And I thought you'd like to know that there are other people who are sort of imaginatively recapturing these worlds that we were told had vanished, and they hadn't.
And I think a lot of people have been working on Taino languages. I mean, there are dictionaries, and I think Fred Kennedy can speak more to this than I can. The language hadn't, well, it comes to us mainly through Spanish, I think. But there is a revival of that language. And in my book, I have a glossary. I used a lot of Taino words because I felt this was a way of bringing the reader close to the culture, but a lot of it is coming to us through Spanish. So, we're not sure. But it's supposed to be derived from Arawak. Arawak is the mother tongue, I guess. That root, what do you call it?
It's a language family.
A language family, thank you. Yeah, which is what, so.
I won't forget this time. This is actually a question for both of you. You talked a little bit about what you'd like to see at a quote-unquote official level in terms of recognition of the Taino past, Olive. I shudder to think what would happen if our government, the one that we currently have, was to dream up some idea of officially recognizing it. What happened, I can't imagine that it would have anything to do with anything positive about the Taino. I would like to ask both of you, what is at stake in the continued suppression of this memory? And what is at stake in reviving this, in commemorating what happened? What actually do you think is at stake?
Well, you're the person who has been researching memory, so why don't you tell us what you've learned?
I haven't researched this particular one, Miss Get Off.
That was elegantly done. I would love to hear what you think, but I would also love to hear what you think. Well, I think what I think is at stake is everything. So, just this past March, I mean, my research is on the Lesserandis and on the Garifuna. Thank you. On the Garifuna people. See, to me, it's really loud. Okay. On the Garifuna people, who are Afro-Indigenous people who are originally from the Southeastern Caribbean, but who now have a huge diaspora across Central America and across North America, and also across the Lesser Antilles. But in March of 2020, of this year, government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which is is celebrated as the homeland, or Yoruba of the Garifuna, finally was able, so it's a complicated story, but was able to declare an island in the Grenadines off of St. Vincent, which is sacred to the Garifuna because of a genocide that occurred there, called Baliso Island, as a public heritage site. And this came after decades of, sort of popular organizing and so on, including by the Garifuna Heritage Foundation. This is a very good thing, it's important. Of course, the problem with that is, again, without getting, into the weeds of politics, I also have concerns about this particular government and the way that it already frames the way that it imagines the state's relationship to this land, and also the levels of state control. So there's always, I think, a challenge. The form of the state that we live under now is, in so many ways, even post-colonial states that I think in so many ways do want the best for their people, in some ways. But it is a colonial form, and it understands land in very particular ways. It understands resources, it understands, there's certain languages, there's a language of land, and it understands it also in very gendered ways. The language of land is patrimony, which we are taught to think of as neutral. It's not neutral, because it embeds certain assumptions about women's relationship to land in the conversation. So I have real concerns, but I also think this is not something the government was going to do without a popular struggle. And it opens up the space for new kinds of conversations within the Garifuna communities about gender, about land, about relationships with the diaspora, like really thinking through how do we know that this is a public heritage site and no longer a private human space. Imagine our relationship to this territory. So I think it is actually an important step, but it is a new phase of an ongoing struggle to undo that sort of those colonial relationships with land. And it's a struggle in which states, Caribbean states, have to be engaged and have to be held to account. And leaders have to be either challenged to think about relationships to the non-human world, but also to the poorest, to blackness, to indigenous people, to dispossession, so in new ways, because they often treat their own people as somewhat disposable. And the only way to do that is to force the question onto the table. So now the governor of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is like, well, what are you going to do with this island, and how are you going to ensure the kinds of the claim they're going to have consultations and so on? Like, well, what does that look like? Who controls this process? So it is, I think, important actually to hold them to account. So yeah, I may share your concerns, but I actually think in these moments there's a moment of opportunity that is real.
Yeah, I just say I agree with what's been said, but in the case of Jamaica, I think the leadership has to come from indigenous people, including Maroons, who are already taking some steps in like the Charlestown Conference, they're speaking out and so on. I see that as a route, that they are the ones, or people who identify with them and share their concerns, are the ones who then have to have dialogue with government about what is to be done. But I agree with you, I don't see this as, although I'm talking about legal issues, but those challenges are coming from those communities to the government. I don't particularly, if it's a government initiative, I would like to see it through the Ministry of Education, through schools, through that form of education. But I don't see the nation itself setting out to memorialize anything at this stage. I think it's something that has to evolve, you know, and I think right now we're in a moment where more and more and more of us need to be conscious of our indigenous heritage and that aspect of our heritage, and we build some kind of consensus around it. I'll just say that the Jamaica coat of arms from the 17th century has had these two Indians, one of whom has a sort of misrepresentation in terms of the iconography. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But they have been on the coat of arms from the very beginning, or early. And then I just learned that sometime in the 20th century, a politician decided that the coat of arms should be redesigned and they should be done away with because they're dead and irrelevant. And what I found interesting in the report is that it was the artists and the writers and the creative people of Jamaica who said no and led the resistance to that idea. So I sort of like that. I don't know that I was around, but if I was, you know, I would have been part of that resistance. So, you know, I think we just have to build the knowledge and build the information, do the teaching that's necessary, and I think things will arise out of this, which will memorialize memory and do more than that.
So we have another reading. I had a question, but I'm not even going to ask it, but only to say, in the context of climate change, and looking at the cover of the book, and the way in which you invoke human and non-human relations, this is a moment where opening that conversation is so important as the Caribbean weathers the next, you know, couple of decades with climate change. Anyway, that was my kind of question, but to say that we have a second reading. We're going to listen some more to passages from the book, and Ava is going to come up and do that reading, and you can sit back and listen to her speak.
I'm going to be reading a section from chapter 6 that centers a conversation being had amongst Taino women. "Ha," said Sun Woman, tugging with her digging stick at the yucca root to loosen it before pulling out the whole plant with both hands. She chopped off the growing top with her axe and scraped away much of the dirt from the root before throwing it into the carrying basket. "I hear they wear the same clothing as their women do, long black robes covering their entire bodies, and they don't have wives either." She said this last bit in a falsetto voice, rolling her eyes and suggestively wiggling her hips under her thigh-leg nagua, made of woven palm fiber stained red with bixa and now brown with dirt. The women within hearing paused in their labors, wiped their sweaty brows, and laughed, and Squash Blossom derisively threw a dried-up sweet potato in Sun Woman's direction. "Sounds just like our Silver Fern," said Root Girl, for their holy man sometimes dressed as a woman. Root Girl was expecting her first child, and her waistband, which had short reed apron attached, was stretched to its limits. None of them had ever seen a priest or even a single panel. The older ones could remember the stories of the foreigners arriving in the east, floating on the water, and the people taking them for gods. For hadn't the elder and prophet Guacanagari of Burikin had a vision of the coming of the Guamakina? After one span of time they had left. Then they'd returned, bringing death and destruction. The cacique, Amera, had not wanted the village to be tainted by the strangers, and had ordered confiscated any of the gifts that made their way there. So the children had no little tinkling bells, the women no foreign beads and shiny mirrors, and the warriors no red woolen hats. Also forbidden were the strange animals and the new plants. Yet, as if nature itself was unafraid to defy the cacique, where seed fell from contraband fruit, new plants were springing up all over the fertile valley, in the woods and out of sight, though people increasingly cut through the vegetation in search of them, for they were magic. On the other islands, Kesikea, Aati, Barakina, Jamaica, the animals the Pere Nigiri brought, pigs, goats, cattle, horses, multiplied and ran wild, and soon would overwhelm their own island of Cuba. It was as if the new world was being overrun by nature's fecundity as the native peoples were diminishing. No one told the hill dwellers that fruit trees and animals from the lands, even some of their own people, were being taken to the land the panels came from, where they too would be seen as exotic or magical. Despite their fear of the ghostly strangers, the women at the Canuco could not resist showing off. Look, Sun Woman said to Root Girl, look at what Burning Spear brought me. Root Girl moved closer to Sun Woman, fished a foreign metal object from her medicine bag. The women took the object and studied its shape, smelled it, turned it this way and that, and passed it from hand to hand. What is it for? I don't know. He traded a fisherman from Plumtree Village 2 spear points for it. 2 spear points? They were impressed. Burning Spear's points were the best. Sunflower, a young girl who had recently joined the ranks of women, said quietly, you are not the only one, and brought out of her bag a beautiful bead of a startling blue. All fell silent in awe, even Sun Woman, for this eclipsed the buckle. Did your husband give you that? Someone asked. Yes, he traded a wooden semi from Corncob's workshop to a man in Baracoa. What? Those fishing folk are making a mint. I bet you he found that somewhere. He says it was blessed by the Pere Nigiri priest. It's to protect me from pain in my joints. You don't have pain in your joints. See? That's why. Sun Woman rolled her eyes, as if the blue bead had opened up a new world, a blue ocean beckoning. Each woman suddenly felt the need to reveal her own foreign acquisition, which she had hidden on her person, or describe those among her personal possessions at home, as if ownership of some objects that had been touched by the Pere Nigiri was the newest marker of status.
Thank you so much, Ava. That was lovely. In particular, I loved in particular the conversation among women and how that's expressed in that passage. So celebrations like these are always the product of many hands who collectively brought to life this space where we're gathered. And I'd like to thank Las Caterers, and I hope you all had a chance to taste some of their wonderful fare. I'd like to thank them for the wonderful food they provided. I'd like to thank the organizing team from the Center for Caribbean Studies and Penn Canada, our wonderful co-hosts, for their generous and careful work in making this evening happen. And the DG Ivy Library, where we're all gathered for the use of this space. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Ava Dickens, Melanie Newton, and the one and only Olive Senior for making this such a beautiful and memorable event. So, this calls to close this wonderful conversation, but there is another section, which is the book. Stand across there. If you haven't yet bought the book, this is the moment. And if there's any food left, we don't want to have to take it away. So please feel that this is still some time to talk among each other and also with Olive. But again, thank you.
History wrong.
Douglas.
We just realized.
I'm good.
How are you?
Lovely.
Yes.
Lovely.
Okay, I'm
Hi.
coming. Hey, how you doing?
Good, good,
Happy
good.
book fair.
Yeah, okay.
Hello.
So I looked around and said, is anybody taping this? Nobody taped it, right? You don't videotape usually.
No, we didn't. You know, we should
I
have.
did.
Oh, thank you.
Because I go to these events and I'm always like, you got this has to be documented.
So could we get that?
Yes, that's why I just came to make sure, I do it. I have a YouTube channel where sometimes I put stuff on, various things that I go to and I post them so people can see them because friends of mine couldn't make it tonight. That's one of the reasons that I said, we know you'll go, you'll tape so we can see it, right? So, but I also want to let you know I have it so I can link you. I can, through Melanie, I'll link you. Yeah. It was wonderful.
On the center site as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Old school photographs.
I know, because the spoken word, the things that are being said,
So true.
and because
Well, to tape, we have to get permission, like their permission.
Yes.
There's a whole process.
Well, you internally, you have to, but I can just come and go. Well, I came and I saw this event and I'm documenting, right? But I will. I'll link you.
And your name,
I'm Douglas. I'm Douglas Stewart. Yeah.
Beverly.
I've known Melanie for a while. Yes.
I could
yes.
tell. Thank you.
Yeah, anyway, lovely event. Lovely
It was
event.
nice.
Yeah. Food was great too.
I know. they're
Did you?
good.
Was that your choice? the
Well,
caterers?
it's the center's choice. We have a couple of folks, and we've always asked.
Really good, innovative kind of
Innovative,
Caribbean,
I think.
the way they did the food.
Very nicely done.
Jerk chicken sliders, and then the ackee and saltfish,
Ackee and saltfish.
kind of bake, right?
Really nice.